It's wonderful to welcome Professor Gary Houchens. I hope I pronounced
Houchens.
Houchens.
Houchens, yes.
Gary Houchens. It's good to welcome you to the program. You are the professor of the School of Leadership and Professional Studies at the Western Kentucky University. And today we're discussing your brief but interesting piece in the American Post-Liberal Substack. It is titled Liberalism Leads to Marxism. Gary, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Thank you. Great to be here.
Okay, let's begin by discussing the word post-liberal because it's a political philosophy or a political movement that I've been interested in ever since I first came across it. So, according to you, what does it mean to be a post-liberal?
Mhm. Well, I think many people who identify with the term are engaged in sort of an extended discussion about what it really means. And on one level, it's very clear what it means. What its long-term political implications are for practice is still to be determined. I think that's part of what the conversation really is about. But I think the term post-liberal has emerged to describe a political point of view that sees liberalism as a key part of the sort of institutional, cultural, and political crisis that the United States and Western Europe seem to be facing right now. Many people who are post-liberals would also identify with the word conservative. But I think there's been a deliberate attempt to use the word post-liberal because so many people who identify as conservatives uh, operate according to a lot of the underlying assumptions of liberalism and are in fact not really conservatives, but what we might think of as right-leaning liberals, as opposed to the left-leaning liberals that, at least in American political parlance, we would normally associate with the political left and the Democratic Party in this country. So I think at least part of the use of the word post-liberal is this recognition that we are all, in one way or the other, shaped by liberalism. It has soaked into our culture in such a way as to affect the way we see the world, often at a level in which we're not even aware, and often for people who otherwise think of themselves as political conservatives. And so post-liberalism, I think, is a term that is meant to help us understand this perspective that challenges both the political left and many elements of the political right.
I think it's true that many of the key texts I've read recently from the post-liberal movement, starting with Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick Deneen, as well as his new book too, Regime Change. These texts have garnered some support from the left, the I suppose the non-liberal left. I know that Dr. Cornel West has praised both of Deneen's books. So I wonder, in your view, what is the appeal of the post-liberal right on left-wing Americans?
Yeah, well, I think that post-liberalism offers a critique of global capitalism that is something that folks on the left inherently identify with, right? So I think post-liberals are I think most of them would say they believe very strongly in subsidiarity. The idea that political decision making ought to be made at the most local level possible. But that doesn't mean that they are necessarily, free market purists. And I think part of the appeal of post-liberalism, both to people on the left and many people on the right who look around at the world and see the problems that we're facing, is its recognition that global capitalism has come with consequences that are negative for many of the elements of life that conservatives are supposed to cherish, like traditional family values and the integrity of local communities and local traditions, and even the integrity of the local environment. has suffered in various ways because of global capitalism. And so I think that is part of the place where post-liberals can readily engage with members of the political left in its economic critique of the status quo.
Mhm. I cannot help but notice that a good number of contemporary post-liberal voices are Catholics. Deneen, Adrian Vermeule, Sorab Amari. I believe there's Yoram Hazony too, but he's Jewish. But
Correct.
but I think Catholic voices seems to dominate the post-liberal discourse. So I wonder if this is a coincidence or is there some Catholic doctrine that supports this their views?
Yeah, I think that it makes sense that many of these early post-liberal voices have been Catholic because the Catholic social teaching for the last 200 years has offered a critique of society that is damning of both far left political views such as socialism and communism, but also quite critical of what we might think of as libertarianism in its various social and economic forms. So Catholic social teaching has emphasized both subsidiarity, which I mentioned a moment ago, this idea that decision making ought to be made at the most local level possible, but that is partnered with a strong emphasis on solidarity. This idea that there is a common good that places obligations on us, and that the state has a positive, proactive responsibility to create a just social order that affects both the culture and the economy. You can't separate culture and economy. Those are two things that are inextricably bound. And so I think, I think at various times, particularly American Catholics, depending on their political beliefs, have either strongly emphasized the solidarity component of Catholic teaching if they tended to be on the political left, or they have emphasized the subsidiarity component if they were on the political right. And each has underplayed the other component of Catholic social teaching. And so I think at least some of these Catholic post-liberals are saying, we really need to take both of the pillars of Catholic social teaching seriously. And if we do that, what we see is that liberalism has posed a great threat to both subsidiarity and to solidarity, and that from that Catholic perspective, we ought to be more critical of liberalism and more attuned to more traditional views of conservatism than we have been in the past.
Okay. But nevertheless, I know that voices like Michael Novak, for example, do not see any conflict between being a good Catholic and being a good constitutional American. I wonder, do post-liberals deviate from this view, or do they are they inspired by him in some way, shape, or form?
Well, I think Catholics who are familiar with Michael Novak's work would find much, conservative Catholics, post-liberal Catholics even would find much in Michael Novak's work that they can strongly identify with, right? I think it's a mistake to assume that because post-liberals see a positive function for the state, that they are enthusiasts necessarily for massive big government top-down sorts of programs. There is certainly variety within the Catholic in the post-liberal world in that regard. You have people like Sorab Amari, who tends to be much more vocal in his support of sort of New Deal, federal level, economic planning types of programs. But many among the post-liberals would say that, yes, while the state has a positive role to play, it doesn't necessarily have to be at the scope at which big government leftists have typically thought of it, and that in fact what we might see is a lessening of the federal role and an expansion of the function of local and state governments to sort of fulfill this role But nevertheless, what we are going to affirm is that the state does have a positive function to play and must play it. And so it does involve a rejection of the sort of strictly libertarian point of view that basically the purpose of the state is only to protect us from one another, and to enforce contracts, to secure the border, maybe print money, right? So the post-liberal following Catholic social teaching, I think, rejects that extreme point of view, right? The trouble is that the post-liberal gets painted as some sort of neo-socialist on economic this economic side of things. And I think that's I think that's a real misrepresentation of how most post-liberals think about the function of the federal government.
Mhm. Yes. I guess I'm way more schooled on the traditional American conservatism of one William F. Buckley, also Catholic, may I add. I guess this school emphasizes the limited role of the state, federal and local, I suppose. So what in I guess, according to you as well as the general post-liberal view, what do you suppose that the state can do that it, I guess, that for traditional conservatives would consider overreaching its limits?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what you see in a lot of the current discourse among post-liberals is more of a conversation about, for example, how do we curb the use of pornography? Pornography is, I think, a scourge on society, and the data on its negative effects is far-reaching. And so post-liberals are willing to say, state and local, maybe even the federal government, have a role to play in protecting children and the general public from this poison. And they ought to play that role. And the knee-jerk reaction to that from many Americans, including the lot on the political right, is to appeal to traditionally liberal points of view about freedom of expression and freedom of the press, and that this should be dealt with in the private sphere rather than having the overarching role of government. So I think that is a good illustration. That particular issue is a good illustration of how post-liberals are willing to use the power of the state to advance the common good in various ways. I think in general, post-liberals are much more willing to entertain things like industrial policy, state and federal policies that would promote domestic manufacturing, would promote higher wages and better benefits for workers, possibly even to promote tariffs at the federal level to encourage more economic independence on the part of the country. And this is one of the places where I think they get crossways of the right liberals and maybe some who would think of themselves as Buckley conservatives, who believe that free trade is a good in and of itself, and that we must just endure the negative effects of free trade because somehow it all winds up being a net gain. And I think post-liberals are willing to say maybe free trade has not been a net positive for us, and maybe we ought to entertain some economic policies that would be explicitly deployed on the benefit of the working class.
Now, just an aside on the pornography question, I would agree that is a harm to society as well as the individuals, in all of the process of making it, the consumers as well as the makers of it. Well, nevertheless, there are certain things that the parents can do that are more effective than the state. So, for example, instead of having a state law criminalizing certain pornographic materials, why not let parents pay for what $20 or so per month for something like Covenant Eyes and install it on all their computers?
Yeah, I think, I mean, certainly, I think most, and of course, I can only speak for myself in this regard. I can't speak for all post-liberals, but I think in general, the post-liberal movement would place an emphasis on um, would agree that parents have a responsibility to protect their children from harmful material, and that it is primarily their responsibility to do that. But that doesn't mean that that there isn't a role for the state in supporting parents in that regard. You might think of education as a parallel. Traditional Catholic social teaching, and I think most post-liberals would agree that um, uh, with the assertion that parents are the primary educators of their children. Parents are primarily responsible for educating and forming their children, and yet most of us believe that there is a role in this for the state to subsidize and support the education of children. And so it's a matter of, yes, subsidiarity means everything starts at home, everything starts as locally as possible, but there are certain social needs for which the state has a role and a function.
Mhm. Yes, I can certainly see that the dimension of what is now politically termed sex work. Yeah, I guess prostitution, for example. I suppose there are laws that can prevent so-called sex workers from soliciting, or that can prevent, say, certain like I guess facilities that enable, I guess, sexual titillation, like those video stores or clubs, from um being from operating near like a neighborhood where there's children.
Mhm.
I think that
Right.
that's certainly viable.
Mhm.
Now, I'd like to ask about what is called industrial policy. I know that I read the quarterly known as American Affairs, and I find it quite interesting. They talk about that a lot.
Mhm.
You quoted Pope Pius the 11th in one of his encyclicals. He says that no one can be at the same time a sincere Catholic and a true socialist. We can delve into the what he means by this later on, but for me at least, industrial policy is, well, the state determines what industries to promote and what I guess supposed not to promote, as well as um, regulating import and exports. And of course, that goes into that word hated by all free traders, protectionism. And in that way, well, it is certainly not socialism in a sense that you redistribute the wealth by taxing all the wealthy, but it is certainly the dimension of nationalizing industry that not too long ago kind of bankrupted Britain. So why would this be recommendable to American industry?
Right. Well, I'm a little out of my field here because I'm not trained as an economist, but I'm pretty widely read, at least among the sort of conservative and post-liberal perspectives on these particular issues. I guess the first thing I would say is that there is quite a difference between actually nationalizing an industry where the state takes it over and operates it versus choosing the kinds of industries that we want to try to promote and encourage more of. And the truth is, this happens all the time, and it happens either on purpose because we encourage and subsidize through various tax incentives or other types of means of encouragement, particular industries. The Obama administration and now the Biden administration's efforts to try to promote solar energy, wind energy, other types of what they perceive to be pro-environment types of industries. This policy already exists. And then we see this already, but you can also see that by not taking action on various dimensions of the economy, we encourage other types of industries to flourish. And so I guess I would just say that the state already, either by its action or its neglect, picks economic winners and losers. So what the post-liberal is willing to say is that it's not socialism to recognize that, but rather good common sense to say that there are policies that our goal ought to be to encourage a flourishing and independent national economy, right? That ought to be the goal. To encourage an economy where all people can be prosperous based on their individual efforts, and that we as a nation collectively are not beholden to other nations for our economic, financial, or physical security, right? And so we should do what is necessary to ensure that is not the case, right? So, for example, the fact that that a vast sum of our antibiotic drugs come from China is a problem from the perspective of a lot of people, and it makes us vulnerable economically and from a security standpoint. And so we ought to encourage the local domestic production of antibiotics for the common good of the country. But that is being willing to say that there is a national common good that is bigger and more important, and that we should prioritize over the good of some other country, or the good of private investors, or the good of the global economy, variously understood. And so post-liberals are willing to say, yeah, there is a national interest that ought to dictate some of our economic policy. It doesn't mean that the government needs to run everything, but that we are willing to say that we do need to make certain priorities explicit.
Well, I'm sure you've anticipated this line of criticism, but Milton Friedman, who's obviously was admired by a great many traditional conservatives like myself, well, he would say something like, well, if China can produce antibiotics cheaper and more effective, then well, good for both China and the US. If say Japan can produce better and cheaper, more effective cars like Toyota and Honda, why should we keep promoting and selling, was it Cadillacs and Fords, given how unpopular they have become, or at least compared to the Japanese vehicles?
Yeah, well, I would say it's great for everybody, for China to produce those cheap antibiotics. Good for them, good for us, until we face a situation where China, which is very willing to advance its own national industrial policy, is willing to withhold that vital product from us in order to advance its own national interest, right? It's well and good for Americans to be able to buy cheap foreign cars, but there is a consequence to that. And at some point, you see cities like Detroit and Gary, Indiana, and Dayton, Ohio, and these other places that have become really desperate places through no fault of the people who actually work there and live there, as a consequence of that, right? And so that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to ban the imports of Japanese cars. That probably was not the right strategy in the 1980s. But I think it also begs the question of, well, what are our responsibilities to the people who work in the steel plants and in the car companies, and how can we advance a policy, an economic agenda that is for their long-term benefit, so that they're not just viewed as sort of, inevitable victims of progress.
Mhm. Now, going back to the Pope Pius XI quotation, you cannot be a true Catholic and a genuine socialist, which is something I agree with. I grew up in socialist Vietnam. It is still the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. And I understand that Marxist-driven socialism has devastated the lives of plenty of people who live under it. Nevertheless, I I do have a quarrel with the free market economists from Austria, like Sir Hayek, and of course from America, like Sir Friedman, that any sort of concession that the market reserves to either the state or society in general is a road that leads to socialism. That phrase, the road to serfdom, that's not something that I particularly agree with. The market is good, but it is based on the notion of self-interest, and self-interest is not a virtue.
Right.
And I guess people who are Catholics are very much emphasized on the quality of human virtue. So, if the typical post-liberal Catholic oppose socialism, then what is his relationship to capitalism?
Yeah, I think I think when you consider the sum total of Catholic social teaching, you cannot help but to conclude that market-based economies are more moral and more just. The concept of private property, even the endorsement of the inevitability of social classes, of economic classes, all of that is sort of written deeply into Catholic social teaching. So I think the only way to properly read a Catholic doctrine on this is to say that market-based economies are morally superior, and it is in market-based economies that human flourishing is most likely to occur, right? We just shouldn't err to the extreme in suggesting then that there is no function for the state to regulate those market-based economies. And I've traveled personally. I've traveled this entire political space in my lifetime. As a young man, I was a self-avowed democratic socialist. And then after I got out of college and had some experience of the real world, for a great number of years, I identified very strongly with sort of right liberalism or libertarianism. I certainly read Milton Friedman and many of the other great thinkers, and Hayek and the other Austrians, and believed very strongly in that point of view. But it's actually as when I had children and I began to try to raise my children in this world, that my perspective on these things began to change. And of course, I started to take my Catholic faith a lot more seriously once I had children as well. And so it was from that perspective as a father that I began to see that I can't raise my children as a libertarian. I need a society that is well ordered, that is ordered to the common good, and that is ordered to the promotion of virtue, to assist me in that work of raising my children. And I could see how liberalism itself has undermined not only the family in their efforts to form their children in virtue, but has undermined society at large in doing so. And that's when I really began to become, I think, first much more traditional conservative in my point of view, a conservatism that precedes William F. Buckley, whose sources are back as far as Russell Kirk and Richard M. Weaver and G.K. Chesterton before them, and T.S. Eliot and so forth, that there is this strain of conservatism that has always emphasized the common good and the traditions that need to be upheld even in the face of market forces.
Yes. Of course, I haven't addressed the title of the piece yet, but this is something that I am very sympathetic with the I guess the post-liberal conservatives, or I guess from now on we should call them common good conservatives. Is that both liberalism and Marxism has a foundation of division. Liberalism with its separation of powers, and Marxism with the separation of classes. Patrick Deneen, in his regime change book, has a wonderful illustration of how both political systems divide the few and the many. Um, and for Deneen, and I suspect for yourself, common good conservatism, in some ways, still maintain that there is such a thing as the few and the many, those who rule and those who are ruled. But the interest between these two groups should be aligned rather than differ. So, and that I think that depends on what you mean by common good. So, what is it?
Yeah, well, of course that's always been subject to debate. What is the common good? And there's a lot that can fit within all of that. But I think the idea, and I think Deneen is particularly adept at articulating this, although he's really echoing material that goes back to Aquinas and Aristotle before him, that hierarchies are inevitable in society. Divisions of power are inevitable. That there will always be an elite that will, take the role of leading a culture, leading a society, but that it is not inevitable that the elite and the people they are leading will be in conflict with each other. And so the idea, Deneen calls it a mixed constitution, which I think might be an unfortunate term because people think of constitutions as sort of the written legal framework of a country. He's talking about something broader than that. But what he calls the mixed constitution is this idea that the elite and the working class, the common folk, should, for the most part, be pointed in the right direction, should be seeking the good of one another. And that their economic endeavors and that their political structures ought to reflect the flourishing of all people, right? And this is part of where liberalism breaks down, because liberalism does not have an understanding of human flourishing beyond just the freedom to do as I please, as long as I'm not interfering with someone else's freedom to do as I please, right? And so, traditional conservative societies always privilege a place for religion, because religion is where human beings are able to really articulate a meaningful understanding of what is human flourishing, right? So from a Christian perspective, it's much easier to say what does flourishing look like for a human person. And at one point, I think we had a much deeper consensus as a culture about what human flourishing meant, because we took the basic premises of Judeo-Christianity for granted as being the foundations of human flourishing. Today, that's much harder to do, because such a great number of people don't take for granted the basic premises of Judeo-Christianity. And liberalism has taught us that faith and what you do in society must inevitably be separated, just as the state must be completely separated from all matters of religion. The individual's pursuit of their faith life is supposed to be private and somehow separate from their public life. And this is an unnatural bifurcation, I think, of both what the purpose of the human being is and the purpose of the state. And so it's quite difficult, if not impossible, to talk about the common good without reference point to a common religious heritage. And I think, again, this is part of the reason that post-liberals are so willing to say, yeah, the state should privilege and promote the faith and religious practice as a normative for most human beings.
Mhm. Right. So I guess in regards to religiosity, it is I guess, a valid prescription, but nevertheless, we can see that historically in societies that are more religious than our own, say Europe in the 15th or 16th century compared to Europe now, um, there are still tensions and divisions between Christians. The Reformation and the Counter-Reformation that led to war. So it is tough to guarantee that when the people have the same basis of Judeo-Christianity, then that means that they can define the common good in the same manner, does it not?
Yeah, that's a great observation. Yeah, the fact that we acknowledge that that Judeo-Christianity is foundational to Western civilization does not guarantee that we won't have conflict with one another. In fact, we can see plenty of examples throughout history where religious people, made war on each other, right? So I don't think I don't know any post-liberals who believe that just reasserting the Christian origins of, the American political tradition is going to solve all of our problems. But what we can say is that explicitly denigrating our religious traditions and trying to sideline them and hide them in the corner has not done us any good socially either, right? And that at least part of what it means to move forward from where we currently are is to reclaim some of our cultural heritage, which means just whether it plays out in any practical political means or not, it still has a powerful cultural impact for political leaders to acknowledge, for example, the providence of God and the obligation that human beings have to try to conform themselves to, the teachings and will of a higher power.
Mhm. Now, I should address also Yoram Hazony's book, Conservatism and Rediscovery, wherein he is illustrating a different tradition, I suppose. He believes that conservatism starts or at least he starts his chronicle of conservatism in the 14th and 15th century in England. And the thinkers that he illustrated, I'm not sure if they are Catholics or not.
Mostly not, right?
Yes.
Fortescue, I think Fortescue was Catholic because that's all there was at the time. But yes, post-Reformation, they would not have been Catholic.
Yes. So he argues that the nation, of course, he also emphasizes Christianity, but he emphasizes the nation state as the foundation of the new conservatism. So there's somewhat of a deviation with Deneen there. And this is something that I've been puzzled about in regards to the new conservatives, I guess, the new old conservatives. Is that they're trying to reconcile the nation, which has borders and is very particular, with Christianity, which is universal. So how can these two entities be reconciled in a polity?
Right. I'm not sure. To me, this is one of the really exciting dimensions of the post-liberal world, is that it's certainly not monolithic, and that there are deep strains of difference in the way that different post-liberal thinkers look at these issues, right? What Hazony and Deneen have in common is a critique of liberalism and its effects, and a desire to order the American polity around something else other than liberalism. And that something else Hazony calls the Anglo-American conservative tradition. Hazony himself, actually, I don't know that he uses the word post-liberal. He wants to reclaim the word conservative, and he particularly wants to promote what he sees as Anglo-American national conservatism. And there are distinct differences. Hazony does not talk about natural law. He mentions this in his book, that maybe at some other time he will get into why he doesn't appeal to natural law. Whereas many of the Catholic post-liberals, drawing on sort of the scholastic tradition going back through Aquinas, they talk pretty openly about natural law and the function that plays. So it's not clear to me as an admirer of both Deneen and Hazony how to reconcile those 2 points of view. I think from a pragmatic point of view, I don't think that we necessarily need to, because the short-term implications of the post-liberal point of view, whether they are coming from Hazony's national conservatism point of view or from perhaps more of the integralist approach of Deneen and Vermeule and others, is that there is a political movement that is already in a nascent form, but is largely lacking a coherent philosophy to guide it. That is ultimately going to be the means by which working class people in America and in Western Europe and the elites can come together around a more traditional understanding of what the view of the human person should be, and how we should organize society accordingly. And so I think it's fascinating to read the philosophical debates within the post-liberal movement. But what's even more interesting to me in some ways is to see the influence that those ideas might play out in practical politics. And, where you see people like Senator Marco Rubio, Senator J.D. Vance. I mean, these are guys who are conservatives. They are advocates of the free market, and yet they are heavily influenced by this notion that liberalism has not done us well as a society, and that we need to be thinking in more creative ways that sort of break up the traditional left-right perspectives on issues like the economy.
Yes, which is why I think the emerging post-liberal conservatism is very exciting. I certainly believe that as someone who adheres more to that traditional, I guess, liberty-based conservatism, I can see myself adopting some of the ideas that the post-liberals have, and hopefully integrate them into the philosophy of traditional conservatism. Now, let's talk about the two ideas which I think the post-liberal sees as I guess anathema or rivals to its own philosophy, liberalism and Marxism. It is true that liberalism and Marxism share in common their de-emphasis on, well, the nation state and Christianity. What I fail to understand is how liberalism, a political philosophy that emphasizes the individual, can lead to Marxism, a political philosophy that emphasizes social class.
Right. Yeah, anything I say about this will in some ways be a summary of much of the argument that I made in the article "Liberalism Leads to Marxism," which is really just a restatement of what Hazony talks about in the book "Conservatism: A Rediscovery," and in particular in his chapter called "The Challenge of Marxism." And so Hazony really lays that out in a comprehensive fashion that is much more nuanced than what I'll probably be able to communicate here. So I would encourage folks to read that book and that chapter in particular. But Hazony's basic argument is that liberalism rests quite heavily on this conception of the equality of persons, and their freedom, their free agency to pursue their own happiness as they wish. And so his argument is that Marxism is so adept at pointing out various examples of inequality and unfreedom that liberals are constantly on the defensive when Marxists draw attention to these examples, right? And of course, there are inequalities of power. There are various and sundry examples where people are not completely free to pursue their dreams as they wish. Some of those examples of inequality and unfreedom are systemic and are because one social group is denying another the opportunity to flourish. But in many cases, the inequalities and unfreedoms that we see in the world are the inevitable product of human society and human choices, right? But because liberalism is so committed to these concepts of equality and freedom, anytime the Marxist says, "Oh, but look at this example of inequality," the liberal is embarrassed that in our liberal, progressive, enlightened society that these differences continue to exist. And so the liberal acquiesces to the demands of the Marxist to prove their commitment to equality and to freedom. And they do that until liberalism itself has been eclipsed by Marxism, and until the very freedom that liberals cherish has been utterly stripped away. And so that is a rudimentary a description of what Houchens tries to lay out in a great deal more nuance and depth than I was able to articulate. But it is essentially that liberals will perpetually acquiesce to the demands of Marxists until Marxism itself has taken over. In my domain, in the domain of higher education, we certainly see how that has happened over time, how our universities went from a place of liberal learning, where it was supposed to be about the free exchange of ideas and the development of human beings for lives of virtue, to a gradual acceptance of all of the neo-Marxist postmodern critical critiques of society, where everything is viewed through the lens of oppression. And so then liberals, embarrassed by the reality that not all social groups are equal, embarrassed by the fact that there are these differences, accept the premise of Marxists that the source of those differences is always oppression, and that the only means of remedying that oppression is retribution against the oppressors. Then we get to a place where we are now, where that critical theory neo-Marxist perspective is the de facto guiding philosophy of many of our institutions of higher learning. And now that has started to seep out into the larger world. And you see a handful of liberals out there, folks like Jonathan Haidt, who are pushing back against that and saying, whoa, 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 this is illiberal. The direction this is going is illiberal. But it was actually the premises of liberalism itself and its inability to articulate a view of the human person that would contradict the Marxist assumptions that inevitably led us to the place where we are.
Yes, and it's true that these days, when the most prominent strain of Marxism in Western political life, especially in the Western academic life, is not the kind that Marx and Lenin thought of, but the revisionist kind that originated in Frankfurt, and with the prominent thinkers like Adorno and Marcuse. The way I see it, what these critical theorists are asking is roughly the same as what the common good conservatives are asking. One is, well, if liberalism promises this and presupposes that humans are free and equal, well, okay, in that case, if we are free to choose what we want, then why is it that people choose the same things? Like we are consumed with the same popular culture, and we are burdened by the same, I suppose, vices stemming from that popular culture. And if we are equal, then why is it that there are people more rich and powerful than others? And why is power concentrated in only the hands of a few dozen people? Now, the critical theorists would answer that is because there's a perpetuation of a culture that distracts human beings from their own liberation, so to speak. Of course, I'm more sympathetic with the answer given by the common good conservatives in that uh, they're the culture that we've built for ourselves have distorted our value system. We valorize the rich and powerful. Think of the people who I guess who really admire Taylor Swift or Elon Musk for some reason. Um, and we and our politics distorts our values too, is now based on interest rather than what is common. So, um, how should so in some ways there's a lot of grounds to convince, I guess, those who are already committed to critical theory of um, post-liberal conservatism. I wonder how would you respond to that?
Yeah, well, that's a great insight that you offered there, is that, I think both Marxists and post-liberals are critiquing liberalism. And some of their critique overlaps, right? Interestingly, the article that I wrote that sort of precipitated our conversation, I had originally titled "What Marxists Get Right and Wrong."
Mhm.
Parenthetically, I wanted to add that "and wrong," right? And I think the editors of the American
Yeah.
Post Liberal thought it's much more interesting to focus on how liberalism leads to Marxism, and that's fine. But that's their prerogative as the editors. But yeah, that was my original idea about this article, was to emphasize that some of the perspective of critical theory is actually accurate in terms of pointing out some of the blind spots, the injustices, the problems with the status quo, and the status quo that liberalism has given us, right? But obviously, post-liberals and Marxists come to different conclusions about what we ought to do about that, right? And so, in terms of how do you persuade the person who is being convinced by the Marxists that liberalism is a problem, I think at least part of that Hazoni addresses in that book chapter, when he says, the problems in current society that Marxism diagnoses really, in many cases, really do exist. The issue, though, is that those inequalities are not always the result of oppression. And even if they are, it begs the question, what are we to do about that? And Marxism has no clear answer to that. Ultimately, Marxism's answer is violence. It is the tyranny of the oppressed over whoever they perceive to be the oppressor. And there's no explanation for how oppression is supposed to end once the oppressed have had their revenge. Whereas traditional conservatism offers a much more robust perspective on all of this, recognizing that, yes, sometimes there are sources of injustice in our society, and some of those are inevitable products of human choices, and some of them are the failure to utilize traditional means by which different groups can show respect and honor to one another. And so the answer to Marxism, the alternative to Marxism and liberalism, is really conservatism, but conservatism stripped of most of its liberal components. And that is an emphasis, and even there's going to be things that are going to overlap, because liberalism couldn't exist without the underlying structure of traditional Judeo-Christian ethics, right? The emphasis on the dignity of the individual, for example. All of this comes out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So it's really calling us back to a restoration of an older understanding of the human person and an older understanding of society, which is not to say that everything from the past is worth preserving. That is definitely not the case, right? All you got to do is look back in history and see plenty of examples where groups were not showing due respect to one another. And so even in conservative societies, you have to make updates periodically and make changes to right wrongs, and to restore your polity to its original commitments and its original values. But that's always understood as a reclamation of an older underlying unity and common good. And so here in the United States, I think our best example of this is the American Civil Rights Movement, which appealed to the original ideas of the American founding and made it absolutely clear how the regime of segregation in the American South and throughout much of the United States was a contradiction of the very values that were part of our founding principles. And so the American Civil Rights Movement was a calling back to something older and more fundamental and more unifying that had been lost. And so we should seek to make changes over time, but it is always done with this deep deference to tradition and to unity. And that's the alternative to Marxism.
I see. Now, I'd like to end by this note. Amongst the many things I find very sympathetic to the post-liberal conservatives, including yourself, is the idea that we should change somewhat the language of how we conduct our politics. Because one of the problems I do have with liberalism is their emphasis on two things, right? Rights and equality. They sound obviously good on paper, but if we apply that to our politics, it leads to a lot of divisions because rights can be disputed between one party or another. And of course, equality can also be a disputed term because even though we treat each other as equals, we are not equals in wealth or talent or social standing, amongst other things. And the word dignity is very important. And I think that a polity that emphasizes the dignity of man is important. So I guess you can have the last word on how can that politics be constructed.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, and I've even come to the place now where one of the words that makes me cringe a little bit in our political discussion is the word liberty. And in my state, there is a strong movement. My state is overall a very conservative state. The Republican Party has a supermajority in our state legislature. So the most interesting political debates that occur in this state are not between left and right, but the arguments that occur within the right itself. And so, we have a number of these anti-establishment political candidates, operatives, and elected officials who identify themselves as liberty candidates. And on most political issues, I agree with them 100%. And I'm very sympathetic to sort of their anti-establishment mentality. But I am uncomfortable with using the word liberty to define ourselves because of liberalism, that word has lost its core meaning, right? Liberty, freedom, does not mean traditionally being able to do whatever I choose to do without interference. Freedom throughout much, and liberty throughout much of Western civilization has actually meant the ability to choose the good, the capacity to do what is in my best interest and in the best interest of my community, to not be a slave to my passions, right? That the normal human condition is not freedom. It is to be enslaved by our more base desires. And so true freedom is the capacity to choose the good even when it is difficult, right? And so I just think that shift in emphasis to what is freedom and what is liberty and what is it for, this idea that humans are meant to flourish in a particular way, And our regnant liberal regime has not led to human flourishing. It has brought us many blessings, which we should be grateful for. But in general, human beings are not flourishing at the level that they should be right now. And we need to organize our work of educating and our work of leading societies and organizing the economy according to just what you said, that principle of human dignity that can genuinely lead to a greater level of flourishing.
It's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Professor Gary Houchens, for joining the program.
Thank you.